Hello, 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 and welcome to the 14th episode of Mixed Media Reviews Season 3. My name is Kelsey, and today I'm going to be talking about a TV show. And this week's TV show is Loki. Mostly Season 2, but a little bit of Season 1. I'm going to be honest, you guys, I wasn't supposed to make this episode. This episode was supposed to be about the phenomenal TV show School Spirits on Paramount Plus. But then I accidentally kind of binged the rest of Loki last Friday, and that completely changed everything. You know how sometimes you'll finish something like a book or a TV show or a movie, and you immediately have to jump onto the internet and look up everything that anyone has ever said about it? That's what happened to me. I immediately went to Tumblr and looked and liked everything I saw. Then I got up and explained to my husband basically the entire show just so I could tell him about like the last 10 minutes of it because it was so freaking amazing. I saw someone say on Tumblr that this was the best thing filmed since Endgame, and even though that would be a pretty easy thing to really do, it genuinely was really beautiful. While there may have been some pretty cool scenes in Endgame, I guess, the ending to Loki was basically better than anything in that film could even have hoped to have been. This was far and away the best thing Marvel has done in forever, and I've genuinely enjoyed the majority of the shows and movies that have come out. We'll exclude Secret Invasion because it was just such an incredibly boring show, which is wild because it was supposed to be like a spy thriller, and yet it was yawn-inducing, and I didn't really care about a lot of the stuff, I guess. I mean, it could have been really cool, and it could have been really interesting, and there were some cool things that happened, and interesting things that happened, but it was still really boring. But this isn't what this episode is about. This is about Loki. And while, this episode isn't going to be as unhinged as my last one, I think we may be in the general vicinity of Unhingedville. This episode will certainly contain spoilers, so if you haven't seen Loki Season 2, please stop immediately and go watch it. And if you haven't even seen Season 1, I promise the journey to the end is 100% worth it. And these seasons are super short, so you have no excuse and you have nothing to lose except for missing out on watching it. So please go watch it. If you've seen the show, you know what it's about, but in case you just want to listen to this because while you have no interest in Marvel, you think I'm a cool lady, and you want to support me by listening to this episode anyway, then I guess here's some context about what this show is about. Basically, there's one timeline, and everyone in the universe must behave in a way that matches up with this timeline. But sometimes people make a wrong choice, or something happens that alters this timeline. This is where the TVA comes in. The Time Variance Authority. When someone acts outside of that timeline, they become a variant. And the TVA then comes in and prunes that variant, wiping them and the branch of the time they create completely out. The Loki in the show is one of these such variants. Basically, something happens during one of those movies we had previously watched, where Loki made a different choice, and the sequence of events were slightly different, and Loki got the Tesseract. This was in Endgame when they go back to steal one of those stones, and they introduce time travel into the movie and everything goes downhill. But basically we remember the scene where Loki then, grabs the Tesseract or whatever. This is basically picking up from that point, which of course is not the Loki from the time period of Endgame, but from the time period of, I think it's the first Avengers movie. But it's in Endgame that they mess up the timeline back then in the Avengers. You still with me? Okay, cool. So anyway, a bunch of stuff happens and the TVA decides that instead of pruning Loki, they're going to use him to find an evil variant of himself that has so far evaded the TVA. And they've been causing some general havoc throughout the universe, typical Loki stuff. And of course, the only person who can find Loki is Loki. So they use him to find himself. Now, at first glance, and arguably throughout the first season, this series felt a bit outside of the Marvel universe. At least for me, it did. I remember my brother and I were talking when the first season came out, and we both kind of felt like it was a Disney ride, if that makes sense. The set felt less real. At the time, Falcon and the Winter Soldier was my favorite Marvel show because it felt much more real than the others previously. It felt rooted within the established MCU. Loki didn't quite feel this way, and I think that's partly because of the kind of 60s futurism vibe the set gave, which, yeah, I do genuinely love. But it still kind of made the events of the show not feel like they held a lot of weight outside of itself. However, as the show progressed, it felt less so. It began to feel like it had real stakes. The introduction of He Who Remains and his variants, who have begun popping up in other MCU films, and the branched timelines themselves even kind of helped root the story within the MCU. Or at least, again, that did to me. I think another big reason is Loki himself. We've seen Loki evolve across the movies. The first glimpse of the man behind the god of mischief was, I think, in the second Thor movie, when we see Loki's cell without the glamour after Frigga's death. This is a big turning point for him. And while Loki still kind of was a big chaotic neutral at this point, we saw him kind of start to begin erring on the side of good more and more often. In Thor Ragnarok, we see him choose to fight alongside his brother. And at the end of the movie, we get that cute little bit where Thor was like, if you were here, I'd give you a hug, and then tosses something at him, thinking it was another glamour, another trick, and it would go through him. But Loki catches it, and he just says, I'm here. We think, finally, we'll see Loki use his chaos for good, but of course we all know what was coming next for Loki. So why am I talking about Ragnarok and everything else? Well, because Loki's arc is an essential part of the MCU, of Thor's story, of Loki's story. We just can't get past it any other way. It is essential to any story that these two will be in. And while, of course, we get the Avengers 2012 version of Loki in the beginning of Season 1, by the end of that same season, we already get glimpses of the Thor Ragnarok Loki, the one who's willing to put himself on the line to help those he cares about, and even total strangers in a way. This is the heart of any Loki story. His mask of mischief that he hides behind slowly begins to peel away and expose that good heart at the core of him. And this show does exactly that, and it is incredibly beautiful to watch it unfold. I can talk about a lot of things that I liked in this show, from the cast to the set design to the scene that we get in Season 2 where Loki is, what do they call it, slipping through time, and he pops up in front of one of those wavy little arm things that are in front of, like car dealerships, and he's making those movements at the same time. Like, yeah, that's brilliant. And there's plenty of other things that happen throughout the show that I could gush about as well. But honestly, I want to spend my time today just talking about Loki, about Tom Hiddleston's portrayal and how absolutely amazing of a job he does in this show. At least at the moment, because obviously we're going to have to talk about Owen Wilson's Mobius, and that's basically part of Loki anyway, so it's still kind of true that I'm only going to be talking about him. Now, let's talk about the ending of Loki, the show, and of Loki himself. Because, my goodness, if you watch anything from the show, find a clip of that ending somewhere, because yes, I said I didn't want to talk about set design, but my goodness, was it a beautifully shot sequence of scenes. I'm smiling and beaming just remembering how gorgeous that final scene was. I love everything about the ending, which I think is a weird thing to say because it's not really a happy ending. It's a bit of a tragedy, right? But it really is written beautifully. As a story, it makes sense, and as a story, it's beautiful. I keep saying beautiful, but guys, if you've seen it, I think you understand. The chaos of the scenes leading up to the end, with him trying every single thing imaginable to get it right, the multiple redos, the looks on the other people's faces as he's just saying things that they never thought he'd say, the moment when Mobius keeps saying no to Loki's plan, only to pause and fully put his trust in him. I love the look on Loki's face when he realizes he can't actually fit the loom. Tom Hiddleston freaking nails it. It's the perfect face. I love when he realizes he has to go back to stop Sylvie from originally taking out He Who Remains, when he realizes he can't actually stop her, when He Who Remains realizes this is not the first conversation they have had, when Loki has in fact already figured out how to control time around him. And I love that when Loki realizes his two options are to kill Sylvie or destroy the loom, the first person he goes to is Mobius. And it's not the Mobius that fully trusts him, but the Mobius that doesn't really even know him, that is still learning who Loki is. And he goes to him so that they can have a frank discussion. It's a flipping of the tables, where previously Loki didn't know what was going on and Mobius held all the cards. Suddenly, Loki knows everything, like everything, and holds all the cards, while Mobius can only react in such an honest way to the man before him. And then Loki hears what he needs to hear from Mobius, as Mobius says, "Most purpose is more burden than glory, and trust me, you never want to be the guy who avoids it, because you can't live with the burden." And when Loki asks how he lives with it, Mobius's response is, "Scar tissue." Loki goes to Mobius looking for comfort, looking for a way to live with whatever choice he has to make, whether that's letting the loom get destroyed and unleashing a bunch of He Who Remains variants onto an unsuspecting universe, or killing Sylvie, his variant, the person he's grown to love. But Mobius tells him there is no comfort. You only choose your burden. And of course, this is a callback to not only this episode's title, Glorious Purpose, and not only the first episode of the series with the same title, but with the entirety of who Loki was prior to this. He constantly spoke of his glorious purpose, of his right to rule. That was what he believed to be his destiny. He spoke it in his previous appearances in the Thor and Avengers movies, as well as in the beginning of the series itself, hence that first episode's title. And yet we see Loki in the second season talk about no longer wanting to rule, about his fears of being alone, his fears of losing his friends. Because while searching for his variant self, he ended up actually searching for his self, of who he is. Loki always felt alone and misunderstood. He was different from his brother and the rest of his family. His father told him that both of his sons were meant to rule, and yet it seemed only Thor was taken to be that rightful ruler. So every journey we see Loki on, whether the original MCU timeline or this variant timeline, we see him discovering along the way that he isn't really alone. In the MCU, he began to bond more with his brother, and in Loki, he begins to bond with Mobius. As they search for his evil variant, he begins to feel less and less alone. He begins to see that his purpose, or his burdens, may actually be entirely different than he believed them to be. Season 1 was all about finding himself, of course, literally and figuratively, and the literal self ends up being Sylvie. He ends up bonding with her, developing a sort of relationship with her, and ultimately he fails to stop her from killing He Who Remains, allowing free will for the first time. Season 2 then sees the consequences of those actions, and ultimately he realizes that in order for him to get what he wants, which is no longer a crown and a throne, but friendship and the connections with the people he's, become friends with along the way, in order to save all that, he must sacrifice himself with that same glorious purpose, that same burden that he no longer wanted. It's a quite beautiful, if I can continue to reuse the word, and tragic journey for Loki, and yet it feels inevitable. Almost like in order for everyone else to have free will, Loki must sacrifice his own free will and give in to his destiny, the destiny of being king. And of course, we get the beautiful scene at the end of him pulling all the timelines together, pulling them into the Tree of Life, which I won't try to pronounce its name because there's too many G's in a row, and I don't even understand how that's a word. I mean, obviously it's a different language, but But anyway, the image of the tree at the end is so incredibly stunning, and it took my breath away. I'm going to be honest here for a moment. I mean, I've been honest, but I'm going to continue to be honest. I hated the Loki-Sylvie romance in season 1, but seeing the end of season 2, I kind of get it now. In season 1, he was still finding himself. He's still his kind of vain, narcissistic self. And the only love he's really truly capable of is a sort of self-love. And even then, right, it's just a bit twisted. It's not true self-love. It's a weird, twisted version of self-love. Not only in the obvious way of loving a variant of himself, but in that he can never fully trust her. And it isn't until we see him finally stand up against Sylvie when he tries to stop her at the end of season 1, where we see this bond begin to evolve into something else. This is where we see him no longer have that weird romantic vibe to his connection with Sylvie. Yes, he still cares for her, but it isn't shown in the same way throughout season 2. Instead, we see Mobius fill this role. Now, some may say this is a platonic relationship, and others, myself included, may be rooting for a less platonic relationship. But I think it's easy to say that Mobius becomes the more important relationship in his life. We see it in their bickering, we see it in how easy they trust each other. And we see it when Loki chooses to see Mobius first when trying to figure out what the right thing to do is. And so it wasn't really until that last episode, after I sat there on the couch trying to absorb it all, that I could truly appreciate what Sylvie was for Loki in that first season. And that was a way to show us how Loki really needed to evolve, how he grew as a person, or a god, I guess I should say. But Sylvie served her purpose. And I don't mean to just say that, that was the only thing that she did was, serve a purpose for Loki. But in a way, she kind of did. I know that sounds terrible, but it was a part of Loki's journey, just as he was a part of hers. He also got her to open up another version of himself, kind of evolving and changing and realizing that going it alone isn't the only way to go. Loki is a show that set out to accomplish something. It had a set goal in mind, and it knew exactly how to get there. This is the type of show you can rewatch and catch things you never caught before, because they knew the entire time where they were going, which can be so incredibly rare. This was such a good watch, and I honestly am still trying to absorb it all, even though it's been over a week. Do I have critiques? No. If this was the end of season 1, I would have immediately brought up the weird love story happening between Loki and Sylvie, but I think the show is great, and one of the few that got the ending right. And I hope they don't get pressured into another season, because as much as I'd love to see these characters interact more, I think it ended perfectly. It doesn't need any more. I do hope we get a bit more of Mobius, though, or the other TVA agents popping up in the MCU. I'd even take a Sylvie popping up as well. I hope we can see some more closure between Thor and Loki. I know I said I think it ended well, but I mean, we could always hope. I mean, yes, Loki is kind of a god of time or something now, but I hope we can get glimpses into him stepping out for a moment or something, right? I mean, he could take a small break. I do think it would be a mistake for him to, be outside of the throne for like a whole movie, but I wouldn't put it, in the trash bin if they were going to have him pop in every once in a while when he sees someone he cares about is in like true danger. I would love that. But I guess we'll see where the MCU goes in the future. And there you have it. Those are my thoughts on Loki on Disney+. Thank you so much for joining me. You can find me on Instagram, Facebook, and Tumblr at Mixed Media Reviews Podcast. Please leave me a comment to let me know if you agreed or disagreed, or if you have any suggestions of what we should do for the upcoming season. You can also find me anywhere you find your podcasts, probably. Please join me next time for the final episode of the season, where I'm going to be reviewing a movie, but I don't know what the movie is yet, but it'll be a surprise for both of us. Okay, have a wonderful rest of the day. Bye!